Happy Easter. Thank you all for being here. You know, sometimes very powerful spiritual teachings come from strange places. Such is the case with a cartoon that I recently saw. Remember, you know the cartoon Family Circus? Remember the sort of the one circle, usually, sometimes there's a couple, but it's always things that children say that bring forth some incredible truth. In this particular caption of Family Circus, there's a little boy and a sister who's just a little bit older, and it's Easter morning, and they've just discovered their Easter baskets, and they're going through, and the little boy said, "Who colored all of these eggs?" And the sister said, "The Easter bunny." And he said, "Well, who gave us all these jelly beans?" And the sister said, "The Easter bunny." And he said, "Well, what about this big chocolate rabbit? Who gave us this chocolate rabbit?" "The Easter bunny." The next caption, they're now dressed and at church. The minister is up front reading from the Bible, and he says, "And they came to the stone and found it had been rolled back. Who could have done this?" to people cried. You're ahead of me. And the little boy said, "The Easter bunny." Well, I think we can probably all agree that whatever happened to the stone, it probably was not the Easter bunny. Easter bunnies, eggs, empty tombs are all esoteric symbols. They're fertility symbols. They're symbols of new life. They're symbols that precede the Christian story of the resurrection. They've been around for many, many, many years. These symbols are pointing to what is known as the resurrection principle, that life is always seeking to bring forth new expressions of itself. There's a wonderful story about Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, that in his life he was persecuted for what he was doing, and it was a time that he felt depressed and very persecuted, and he felt like, gosh, if I'm doing God's work, why am I being persecuted? Where's God? He felt like God had abandoned him. And one morning his wife came downstairs in mourning clothes, M-O-U-R-I-N-G, and he looked at her and he said, "Who died?" And she said, "Well, according to the way you're acting, God did." And she sat down. He got irritated and he got up and he went outside and he began to walk around and look. And he noticed all of the fresh life around him, and he went back and he wrote, "The promise of resurrection is not written in books alone. The promise of resurrection is written in the leaf of every springtime." And so it is. Max Hendel says, "At this time of year, an augmented energy sweeps with an irresistible force through the veins and arteries of all living things, all living beings, inspiring them, instilling hope, new ambition, new life, impelling them to new ways of being. Even the plants respond by an increased circulation of sap, which results in additional growth of the leaves, the flowers, the production of fruit. Every form of life expressing itself, evolving to higher states of being, and within us, higher states of consciousness." The scriptures say, "Behold, I make all things new." That truly is the Easter story. Easter is considered a very sacred, a very holy time. This day, if you think about it, around the world, in temples and in churches, people are talking about the very same thing, this resurrection principle. And whatever level of authenticity we may ascribe to the story, it is undeniable that there is a resurrection principle at work in life, that all of life continues to bring forth greater expressions of itself, that all of life is a representation of the one greater life force. And that's what we celebrate that today. In remembering that we are presencing a presence that is greater than our individual self. And this presence is immediately available to all of us, that we can never be separated or disconnected from our source, however we can think ourselves apart. And this day is truly about remembering that connection. Last week we talked about Palm Sunday and the things that Jesus did that led him to be killed. He was crucified, hung on a cross with a crown of thorns on his head, which was considered horrible punishment at the time. He was hung between two thieves, and so he was basically killed as a criminal for doing and speaking out against the religious leaders at that time. It was primarily the religious leaders that saw to it that his life was ended. And the political leaders in Rome, when Jesus talked about a new kingdom and God to the Romans, Caesar was God, and they were the kingdom. So they didn't understand what he was talking about. And today we're going to look at what's called the Farewell Discourse in John, and some of the last things he shared with the closest people to him and what we can take away from that. The other things that are really important at Easter for me is to talk about Jesus and the Christ. In Unity, we look at Jesus the man as an individual who actualized his potential, his divine potential. And his great message was, we're all here to do the same thing. In Unity, we describe the Christ as that perfect pattern of being, the divinity within us that is within all people. We say, I behold the divine in you, I behold the Christ in you. But sometimes people don't realize that when we say Christ, we're not saying Jesus, that Jesus was a man and Christ was a title. Christ means the anointed one. And sometimes people also don't understand that even though in Unity we use the term Christ, we're not speaking about anything that is exclusive to Unity. Would you give me this first slide? I always like to share things. In Hinduism, the term Atman, listen to the definition of Atman. Atman is the immortal aspect of the mortal existence. It is the self hidden within creation. It is the microcosm representing the macrocosm in each of us, imparting to us divine qualities and possibilities and providing us with the reason to exist and experience life. Atman is Brahman. Brahman means God, all that is. So Atman is Brahman itself. Atman is God itself, the very self which informs, infills, incarnates into man to participate in life. To me, we could just substitute the word Atman for Christ. It is saying the very exact same thing. The next one comes from the ancient, this one comes from the ancient Charles Fillmore, a part of Unity. Unity's co-founder, Charles Fillmore, said, each of us has within him the Christ, just as Jesus had, and we must look within to recognize and realize our sonship, our divine origin and birth, even as he did, by continually unifying ourselves with the one power and the one presence. That our goal is to bring this presence into being. The next one, the very ancient Greeks, the followers of Hermes the Great, said, the essence of the cosmic Christ is the regenerative and reconciling aspect of the force of pure being and the soul essence within each of us. Hence, it represents the unfolding energy of wholeness in human nature. Again, they're pointing to the same thing that we call Christ. And then the last one that I find interesting is from Yogananda. Yogananda said, the Christ consciousness within you has long remained hidden. Awaken this universal Christ by daily deep meditation and resurrect yourself from the tomb of ignorance. Yogananda would teach that the tomb of ignorance is the tomb of our unconsciousness, the places where we're not yet awake to the truth of our being. And so the next one, Jesus himself said, I can do nothing of myself, that what I do, the works of the Father working in me. And he went on to say that the things that he did, we were to do these things, we could do these things, and even greater. And that's what we talk about here today. When I think about the Christ and what it means in our life, that what is the significance of Easter over 2,000 years ago? When we go back and we talk about the essence of our true being, the Atman, this Christ presence, this divine spark, the fact that life itself is bigger than what we may call life and death. That life, all that is this animating presence that gives us windows into an experience of life and death. And that presence which does that we call the Christ. And that is continually moving away the stones, the blocks, the limitations in our life. It is continually calling us into deeper and deeper and higher levels of consciousness to reflect our potential, just as Jesus and other master teachers did. To me, there's a beautiful true story that illustrates this. Many years ago, there was a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, and at the center of this monastery was this gorgeous Buddha. The monks, every time when they would come and say their alms and meditate, they would be in the presence of this big Buddha. Well, a highway was coming through their town, and they were told that they were absolutely going to have to move their monastery. There was no way around it. That meant they would have to move this precious centerpiece, this giant Buddha. So they got the equipment. The day came when they began to pick it up and to move this Buddha. And just as they were loading it, they noticed it cracked, and their hearts sank. They were so disappointed. It also began to rain. They had moved it out from under its covering, and it began to rain. And so they covered it with tarps and said, "We'll come back the next day." That night, the head monk was out, and he just kept walking around thinking about what were they going to do. And he would shine the flashlight to make sure no water was coming in. And once when he shined the flashlight in, he saw light coming back to him. And so he went closer, and as he went closer and shined the light, he saw something in the crack. And he did the unthinkable. He actually began to put something in there to try to break it open a little more. He tapped in and he felt something. He began to crack and move it away. Would you show me the next slide? What he wound up unearthing was this, which today sits in Bangkok, Thailand. What they did not realize many, many years earlier, this was the centerpiece of a Buddhist monastery. And the Burmese militia were coming through, killing all of the Samis at the time. The monks knew they would probably die, and they knew that this would be stolen or destroyed. And so they carefully covered it with clay. They packed it with layers and layers of clay. They were, in fact, all killed, but because this clay thing sat there, the Burmese militia went on their way. Years later, when they were forced to move it, then and only then did they find out that what was really all of these years, they thought they had a clay Buddha. That's what they had the entire time. And if you go to Bangkok, Thailand today, you can literally see this. To me, that makes me realize that how many of you have ever felt like life was cracking you open? That life was asking something of you that you felt like you didn't yet have. You didn't know. That when we come to the edge of our resourcefulness, that we're being asked to die to old ways of knowing. To die, the symbolism of the resurrection death, the only way to be born anew is to first die. But yet it's not simply a physical death. More importantly, it's every day, as the Buddhists would say, go to a beginner's mind. Let every day be a death to the life the way that you think you know. To bring your best self forward and to be open, because life continues to crack us open. And so this Jesus trying to teach people about the Christ presence within him. In the Gospel of John, there's a group of scripture that are called the Farewell Discourses. And this is sort of the speech he gave to his closest followers when he knew his impending death was happening. He talked about persecution. He said that every time there's a breakthrough in consciousness, those who can yet not go there become defensive and hostile and violent. He reassured them that even though he was going away, they could continue to remain open to the Spirit and to the new understanding that they had. This is the place where he reminding them of their connection to the one true vine. He said, your job is to stay attached to the true vine in consciousness, because you can't bear fruit if you're not consciously connected to the vine, to your source. He used analogies that he thought his audience could understand, because for them, God was up in the sky. You see, the God of heaven was up in the sky. The God of earth was the Roman emperor. So to his audience, to say that God was mutually indwelling, that in God you live and move and have your being, and that God lived in you, this was a foreign concept to them. But that's what he was trying to help them understand, is that God dwelled within you. Bishop Shelby Spong reads writes this, these last words he paraphrases that Jesus shared with his followers. You must not be dependent on me. You must rise to a new level of responsibility and maturity. It is to your advantage that I go away. God cannot be limited to one mediator. All of you are lives in whom and through whom God can work. I was a doorway into a new experience for you, but once you've walked through the doorway, there is a limitless spirit that can and will engage you. This spirit will open new doors and lead you into all truth. Trust what you know, trust who you are, live into your new being. I love that last line. Live into your new being. And so for me, that's what Easter is really about, living into our new being. What does it require of us? It requires us to be open. To constantly be open to, I do this many times, that was then and this is now. That I may think I'm just this clay covering of a person, but there's this golden Buddha, this golden Christ within me that is seeking to bring forth more. That was then and this is now. And that in my life, I ask myself often in my life, where do I put a period? Like that's just the way it is. Or this is all there is. I think what the Spirit of God would tell us that wherever there's a period, there's an opportunity for there to be a ... You know, I like to use the ... because that means there's more to come. And where do we let our buts get in our face? That I would do this, but I can't. She would do this, but I know she can't. What if instead of buts, we got into yet? I don't yet know how to do this. I have no idea yet how I'm going to get myself out of this conundrum. But it's a whole different, it keeps us open. It's the difference in the dot versus the ... That's the goal, is to be open, that we may be an opening. And that requires us to be teachable and reachable. There's a story about a young man who, he was actually in his early 30s, and he had failed at a couple of jobs, and he had some real self-esteem issues. And finally, he went and he got his certification, and he was working for the Department of Agriculture as an inspector. And he had a lot of pride in that. He had a little badge with his name on it. He was now an official inspector, and he had pride about what he did. So he went out to this farm one day, and he was getting ready to inspect, and he approached the older farmer, and he said, "Sir, I'm here from the Department of Agriculture. I'm here to inspect your entire farm." And the man said, "Well, I didn't know you were coming." He said, "Sir, I'm here with the Department of Agriculture, here to inspect your entire farm." He said, "Okay, fine, you can inspect it. Just don't go and unlock that back fence." And he said, "Sir," and he showed him his badge, "I am here from the Department of Agriculture. I'm here to inspect your entire farm." The man finally just did like that. So the young agriculture inspector went out, and he was gone for about an hour until he came running as fast as he could with a bull behind him. And he yelled to the man, "What should I do? What should I do?" And the old man said, "Why don't you show him your badge?" That's how we are sometimes in life, that we're so attached to, this is my badge, this is what I can do, this is who I'm supposed to be, this is what I know, this is how I can show up, that we're not yet reachable. We're really not teachable. And that's the goal, is for us to become reachable and teachable. There's a story of Babe Ruth, that Babe Ruth was known as, of course, as you know, as being a great baseball player. That one of the things about him, he was incredibly reachable and teachable. He had a heart of gold, they said. And there was a young boy who had been kicked in the head by a horse, had a terrible wound. It got infected. The boy was dying. And the boy's last wish, he had always wanted to see Babe Ruth play baseball. And so they got word to Babe Ruth and said, "Our son is dying. His dying wish, he wants to see you play baseball, but he can't do that. So he's asking, will you hit a home run for him?" And as the story goes, Babe Ruth sent word back, and he said, "I will hit a home run for you." And in that particular game, the people said that at a point in time in the game, Babe Ruth literally stepped out of the batter's box, pointed, and he hit a home run right where he pointed. And it was for that little boy. Babe Ruth actually hit 3 home runs in that game. The little boy recovered and lived to be in his 70s, and he's known as the little boy that Babe Ruth saved his life. But Babe Ruth always said, I've always tried to draw upon something that elevates my game. I try to draw upon something that elevates my life. I try to draw upon something that elevates who I know myself to be. To me, that's the story of the essence of the Easter story is, am I reachable? Am I teachable? Am I drawing from that which elevates me, or am I focused on that which brings me down? Because you see, where vision ends, limits begin. Wherever our vision ends for ourselves, wherever our vision ends for another, we've just created a boundary, a limit. The story of Easter is to always allow your vision to be elevated, to be open, to be teachable, to be reachable. There's another true story of a colleague of mine, a man who had a Mitsubishi Evolution that happens to be a high-performance car. This guy's a minister, and he had this car, and he really took a lot of pride in the car that he had. He cared for it like it was his baby. And one day, on a Monday, he had just had his Sunday services. Mondays are, a lot of ministers take Monday as a day off, so he went to the tire store. He needed to get new tires for his car. And as he drove up and he parked, he said he happened to notice one of the mechanics walk around, and he did a double take because it almost looked like his daughter. And he thought, good Lord, do they let children work here? The girl looked so young, and he thought, I sure hope I don't get her. So he goes in and he tells them what he needs for his car, and they said, well, go out back and we'll send our best mechanic to help you with that. And he said he walked around, and he couldn't believe it when he looked up, and there comes the young girl walking towards him. He just noticed his thought, because his first thought was, what does she know about tires? How is she possibly going to help me? Not only did he notice his thought, he said he began to pay attention in his body, how he started feeling irritated and some resistance about this, that what was happening. Well, incidentally, he had just spoken the previous day about how to bring awareness to our thoughts, and how do our thoughts about ourselves or somebody else limit a blessing. And so he thought, I'm going to practice what I preach and just do the best I can to be open, receptive here. So as she approached, he was trying not to be biased. He began to talk, and she said, well, let me see your car. And so when he went out and saw the car, she said, oh, you drive a Mitsubishi Evolution, so do I. She drove one. He continued talking, and he found out not only did she drive one, she was a race car driver of one. Not only did she drive one and was a race car driver of one, she was one of the most well-known mechanics in the area for that particular car. And he talked about how in the world did the universe match me up with a young girl who could tell me more about my car than I even knew to ask. It was one of the greatest blessings. But because of the judgments, because of those things that so often, so many times in life, we put our own stones, we close out our own blessings. The goal is to be reachable, to be teachable at all times. So there's a mantra that is in song that I'd like to share with you that you can learn. This mantra is an affirmation, it's a prayer. Would you give me that song? That invites this Holy Spirit, this gentle spirit, this whole spirit of life into our awareness, that would keep us open and reachable and teachable. And it goes like this. Gentle Spirit, flow in me. Gentle Spirit, grow in me. Gentle Spirit, show in me. Gentle Spirit, know in me. Gentle Spirit, flow in me, flow through me, grow in me, show in me, and know in me. Would you sing it with me? Gentle Spirit, flow in me. Gentle Spirit, grow in me. Gentle Spirit, show in me. Gentle Spirit, know in me. You sound beautiful. Sing it again. Gentle Spirit, flow in me. Gentle Spirit, grow in me. Gentle Spirit, show in me. Gentle Spirit, know in me. And so that's a mantra that you can use throughout your day, throughout your life, any time in your life that says, keep me teachable, reachable, and open. Would you give me just the music very softly on the keyboard, Richard? The last story I want to share with you about that is another true story. Dr. Frank Mayfield was touring Tewksbury Institute. When on his way out, he accidentally collided with the elderly floor maid. To cover the awkward moment, Dr. Mayfield started asking questions. Well, how long have you worked here? As he picked her up off of the floor. I've worked here almost since it opened, the maid replied. Well, what can you tell me about the history of the place, he said. She said, I don't think I can tell you anything, but perhaps I can show you something. He took him inside, she took him inside, and she took him down some stairs and in the back to this old institution. And she showed him these rusty bars in this cage. And she says, this is where Annie was. Annie was a young girl who threw food at anybody that tried to feed her. She would yell out and scream. No one knew what to do with her. She was incorrigible. She said, I was only a little bit older than Annie. And it broke my heart to see her in that cage. And so one day I made some brownies. And I went and I put them close to enough where Annie could reach them. And I said, Annie, I made these brownies for you. And then I turned around and I ran as fast as I could because I didn't want her to throw them at me. But I noticed she ate the brownies. And so the next day I did the same thing. I brought Annie some brownies and I got a little closer and I stayed just a little bit longer. And as the days went by, I began to be able to talk to Annie. One day one of the nurses passed by because they heard Annie laughing. And they stopped and they said, how did you do that? And she said, well, I just started bringing her brownies and now we talk. And so the doctors and the nurses came and they said, well, you go in first with her and then we're going to follow you in. She said, they made me go in first, but I did. And that day I actually sat down and I held Annie by the hand. And I began to talk to her. And it allowed the doctors and nurses to finally get in and be able to help her a little bit. We were friends for about a year. And then the Perkins Institute opened and they sent Annie away. They found out that she was blind. And that's why she had been acting the way she did. When Annie first went to the Perkins Institute, she was so humiliated because people made fun of her. But Annie said, the love and the sweetness of a brownie and another young girl who held my hand gave me the courage to keep trying. She went to school, she learned. Not only did she graduate, she became the valedictorian of her class in 1886. In her valedictorian address, she charged her classmates and herself with these words, fellow graduates, duty bids us to go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our especial part. When we have found it, willingly and faithfully perform it. Annie graduated and went on to become a teacher. She went back to the Tewksbury Institute to thank the floor maid who gave her the brownies. And she went to the directors of the institute and said, is there anything that I can do to help repay what you have done for me? And the director said, well, I don't know of anything that you can do. And then he said, well, wait a minute. I got a letter here from a gentleman. And Annie read the letter, and it was from a father who had a daughter The daughter was seemingly deranged. She was throwing food at people. She was incorrigible, just as Annie had been. And Annie said, I'd like to go visit that family. And so she did that. She went and visited the family. And the father asked if she could help his daughter, Helen. Annie Sullivan, the teacher of Helen Keller, would be able to both be reachable and teachable because someone loved them. Someone gave them. It all started with a floor maid who gave a brownie. When Helen Keller literally won the Nobel Prize, which she did, Annie Sullivan was in the audience. And they said, Helen, would you like to thank? And she said, I'd like to thank Annie Sullivan. And before she could finish, Annie Sullivan jumped up and said, no, Helen. You and I both need to thank the floor maid at the Tewksbury Institute. When I heard that story many years ago, I've never forgotten it because it reminded me of this life presence that is the Easter story of a young girl who with a brownie was saying, gentle spirit flow in me, gentle spirit grow in me, gentle spirit show in me, gentle spirit know in me. Would you sing it with me? Gentle spirit flow in me, gentle spirit grow in me, gentle spirit show in me, gentle spirit know in me. Once again, gentle spirit